When we picture the Middle Ages, the mind often fills with images of knights in shining armor, castles towering above green hills, and grand feasts in candlelit halls. But beneath those grand images lies a much harsher story, especially for women. Life for women in medieval Europe was rarely glamorous, and for most it was a daily struggle marked by hardship, heavy labor, and very few choices of their own. Tonight, we'll take a slow walk through their world. To begin, we must remember that society in the Middle Ages was built like a ladder. At the top stood kings and queens, below them the nobles, then knights, and finally, peasants. Women could be found at every level, but their roles were tightly controlled by expectations of family, religion, and survival. The church taught that women were weaker than men and should live in obedience to fathers or husbands. This belief shaped nearly every part of a woman's life. For the vast majority of women, peasants living in small villages, life revolved around endless work. From dawn until dusk, women tended fields, baked bread, spun wool, carried water, and cared for children. Imagine waking up in a one-room hut, the air filled with smoke from a small fire, the ground damp, and the roof dripping when it rained. A woman's day might begin before sunrise, carrying heavy buckets from the nearest well. Then she would help her husband in the fields, planting or harvesting by hand, before returning home to grind grain, knead dough, and bake bread for the family. This work never ended. During harvest, entire families labored in the fields, children included. In winter, women mended clothing, patched roofs, and spun thread by hand. Their survival depended on constant effort. If crops failed, hunger followed, and women often ate less so their children and husbands could eat more. But physical hardship was only part of their struggle. Women had almost no legal independence. A peasant woman could not own land in her own right unless her husband had died. Even then, widows were pressured to remarry quickly, often losing control of property to a new husband. Women's bodies were also controlled by marriage and childbearing. Most women were married in their teens, and they were expected to bear many children, despite the dangers. Childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for women in the Middle Ages. Religion shaped much of this experience. The church praised women who lived as obedient wives or devoted nuns. Nuns did have slightly more independence, especially in convents where they could study, write, and manage property. Some abbesses were powerful, overseeing land and wealth. But even in convents, women were still under the authority of male bishops and priests. At higher levels of society, noble women lived very different lives, though not necessarily easier ones. Daughters of nobles were often married off as children, their marriages arranged to form alliances. They were valued less for who they were and more for what their families could gain. A noble woman might be sent to live in her husband's castle at age 12 or 13. Her duty was to manage the household, oversee servants, and most importantly, to produce heirs. Yet noble women were not powerless. While their husbands were away at war or crusades, some managed entire estates, collected rents, and defended castles. Chroniclers tell us of women like Eleanor of Aquitaine, who influenced politics and shaped kingdoms. But these were rare exceptions. Most noble women lived confined lives, their days filled with needlework, prayers, and waiting. Peasant or noble women faced risks of violence. In times of war, villages were burned, families scattered, and women were especially vulnerable. Within households, they had little protection from abusive husbands, as the law often sided with men. Medieval society viewed women as property, first belonging to fathers, then to husbands. By now, you can see how brutal was not an exaggeration. It was a world where choice was limited, freedom rare, and survival a constant battle. And yet, women endured. Through labor, resilience, and community, they carried medieval society on their shoulders, even if history often forgot their names. That concludes part 1 of our journey into the lives of medieval women. In part 2, we'll look closer at their health, daily routines, punishments, and the few rare pathways to power that existed. As we return to the world of medieval women, let's sink deeper into the details of daily life. Beyond work and marriage, the body itself was a source of endless struggle. Medicine in the Middle Ages was a mix of folk remedies, superstition, and religious practice. Women bore the heaviest burden of poor health care. Childbirth was one of the most dangerous experiences. Without modern medicine, infections, hemorrhages, and complications often led to death. Midwives assisted, using herbs, charms, and prayers in the birthing chambers, but survival was never guaranteed. A woman might give birth 10 or 12 times in her life, with only a few children surviving to adulthood. Imagine the constant grief of losing children, yet needing to continue working the very next day. Hygiene was another challenge. Bathing was rare, especially in rural villages. Women washed their hands and faces, but full baths were uncommon. Clothes were worn repeatedly until they fell apart. Lice, fleas, and disease spread easily. When plagues or fevers struck, women were often blamed as witches or sinners, accused of bringing illness through magic or disobedience. These punishments for women could be cruel. If accused of gossiping too much, a woman might be forced to wear a scold's bridle, a metal mask that clamped her tongue. Accused witches were drowned or burned. Even small crimes like stealing bread could result in whipping or public shaming. These punishments reinforced the idea that women were to be silent, obedient, and fearful. Still, women carved out spaces of resilience. Markets gave women a chance to sell cheese, eggs, and cloth, earning small incomes. Some women worked as alewives, brewing beer to sell. Others served as healers, midwives, or caretakers, passing down knowledge from mother to daughter. These small acts gave women a measure of independence in a restrictive world. In towns and cities, opportunities were slightly broader. Women could join guilds, work in trades, or run shops, if widowed. In places like Italy or France, merchant widows sometimes managed successful businesses. Yet these were exceptions, and most women remained bound by the heavy chains of gender and class. At the highest levels, queens occasionally wielded real power. Queens like Isabella of France or Margaret of Anjou influenced wars and diplomacy, but they did so within a system that never truly saw them as equals. Even when powerful, women were often criticized more harshly than men. The image of women in medieval culture tells us much. Literature often painted women as either saints or sinners, pure virgins or dangerous temptresses. Real women, of course, were neither. They were workers, mothers, daughters, healers, and survivors. Their lives were not defined by myth, but by endurance. As we close this long reflection, we should remember that the survival of medieval society rested heavily on women's labor and sacrifice. They baked the bread, raised the children, tended the fields, and held families together through famine, war, and plague. Their lives were often brutal, but they carried on. Tonight, as you rest, think of those countless women whose names never made it into chronicles or tales of knights and kings. Their lives may have been overlooked, but they built the foundation of medieval life. And now, their stories whisper softly through history, reminding us of their strength, their endurance, and their quiet, unseen power. As the Middle Ages wore on, the life of a woman remained deeply bound to silence, labor, and endurance. A woman's voice, especially among the peasant classes, rarely carried beyond her home. Decisions of property, justice, or even family direction were often made by men. Still, women carved small spaces of influence through whispered advice, through their role in maintaining households, and in rare cases by managing estates when husbands were away at war. For many, the brutal weight of childbirth defined their existence. There were no doctors in the modern sense, and midwives relied on experience passed down through generations. Herbs, charms, and prayers filled the air of birthing chambers. Mothers often faced the ordeal in cold, dim rooms with only a few attendants and no guarantee of survival. Mortality was common, both for mothers and for infants. To endure childbirth was to gamble with life itself, a reality faced over and over again by nearly every medieval woman. Beyond childbirth, the cycle of endless work continued. A peasant woman arose before dawn, tending animals, grinding grain, baking bread, and carrying water, often with a baby strapped to her back. Her day was relentless and rest was scarce. The brutality was not always in open violence, but in the sheer weight of endless labor that left bodies aged and tired before their time. For noble women, the burdens were different but still harsh. While peasants bore the hardship of physical work, noble women were bound by politics and reputation. Marriages were arranged for alliances, and personal choice was rare. A young woman of noble birth could find herself married off to a man decades older, expected to produce heirs and maintain the dignity of her household. Her life was one of controlled appearances, where even private behavior could ripple outward into scandal or danger. The church cast a heavy shadow over all women. Sermons